And this is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, all talk and all crime. The Cheshire home invasion murders, the Connecticut Route 8 murders, the New Britain strip mall murders. We're talking murder in Connecticut from an expert on local serial killers today on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Ann Howard has a blog on serial murders in Connecticut. She's a lawyer currently representing individuals who've been denied Social Security disability benefits. She's an aspiring crime novelist, and she joins us. How are you, Ann?
I'm very well. How are you, Jim?
So tell us, how does someone get interested in serial killers?
Well, I think for me the real interest is in the true crime genre and in writing and reading true crime. And, of course, a big subject matter in that genre has to do with serial killers. So as it happened, when I moved to Connecticut 5 years ago, I learned that there were some serial murders not far from my house, so I started to research that regarding the Route 8 murders and blog about it. And then I moved on to writing about the New Britain serial murder suspect, William Devon Howell, and I'm currently writing a book about him right now. We're in close written and person-to-person correspondence.
Fascinating. What commonalities have you noticed as you've gotten pretty close to these? We'll go into detail about some of them, but what about across the board and sociopaths? And how does a sociopath cross the line into becoming a killer? What have you seen putting it together?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Before going into this, I read a lot of Roy Hazelwood, who is an FBI profiler. Many people would argue that he's the one that started the whole psychological profiling of serial killers that now the FBI and other law enforcement agencies just rely upon very heavily in determining who may have committed these crimes. And based on his research, what was determined was that the serial killers have a very rich fantasy life. And at some point, that fantasy life crosses over a very dangerous line and exhibits itself in the real world. It may do so slowly, as in the case with Connecticut's most prolific serial killer who died of lethal injection. I believe it was back in 2007. That was Michael Roth. And I recently read a book about him where he started off just with the minor fantasies of a damsel in distress, and he had kept her captive and helped her, and then slowly that wasn't enough. And what tends to happen is their psychological, a very damaged inner childhood or rage inside of them starts to surface and become reflected in these fantasies. Ultimately, they need to act them out for gratification, and the acting out can start with simply stalking or assaulting and then escalate into something far more nightmarish.
Wow. Do you think that as you get deeper into this, does evil exist? Are these people evil? What is evil?
Yes. There are so many different interpretations. You can go with the psychological approach of, this is a DNA mix-up, like some dogs are just born mad dogs and need to be put to sleep. It could be a genetic thing. It could be, a brain trauma. Was the child dropped on their head as an infant? With respect to the issue of evil, if I had to say in my opinion, yes, I do believe in evil. I guess fundamentally I'm Catholic. Like most Catholics, I'm not, going to church every Sunday. I should be. But I hold true to some of those tenets about good versus evil. And I do think at a certain point, an individual with a depraved mind can allow themselves to ruminate on evil thoughts and have those thoughts come to fruition. It's like anything else that you dwell upon. And I think you can couple that as well, though, with a tendency to psychological obsession. So they start to ruminate, and because of their neurological makeup, it just gets into a terrible pattern of obsession.
Very interesting, Ann. Okay, we're going to look into the Cheshire home invasion murders now from one perspective. We've covered it a bit on our show. It's kind of personal to me because Bill Pettit went to Dartmouth, where I went to business school. It's a crime that involved rape, strangulation, arson, murder. It's just horrific. And you've actually gotten to meet with and even at one point considered writing a book with Stephen Hayes, one of the two folks involved. What's he like?
Oh, he is a very complicated man, as are many of these criminals who have done such heinous deeds. I met with Mr. Hayes at Northern Correctional Institution in May of 2015. At that time, he was still on death row. It was just a few months prior to the Connecticut Supreme Court making that decision that the death penalty in Connecticut was unconstitutional and fell under the definition of cruel and unusual punishment. The man I met on death row was in stark contrast to the man that I had read about who had committed such unspeakable atrocities, and even physically, he looked completely different than he did in his mugshot at the time of the 2007 Cheshire home invasions. He was extremely thin, even frail, very emaciated. Clearly, the life of being on death row had taken its effect on him physically and mentally. He had extreme insomnia. So when we met, I could see visibly the dark circles under his eyes, and his skin was like paper thin because of pacing his cell, literally night and day. And again, he would ruminate on the crimes that he had committed, and he expressed to me an extreme self-loathing that he felt regarding his role in those crimes, deep remorse, but also just sort of racking his brains night and day about how did this come upon me. He almost felt like a victim, like this thing came into his life almost out of his control, and because of that one night, his whole life has been awful ever since. He came across, surprisingly, as very gentle in his demeanor, and to some extent I felt like he was playing me a little bit. Actually, the further away I get from that visit, the more I feel that he does play people, and there was a strong element of manipulation in the rapport that we had. So yeah, he's a very complex and troubled man.
What was he trying to manipulate you to? That he was a better man that he comes across, and that he's this victim of this horrific crime?
Yeah, I believe one of the things that I found to be manipulative, not without validity, but on the other hand, not the whole story, was his whole premise for wanting to have me write this book, which was that he wanted it to do good in the world, especially in light of the fact that his life up until now, especially regarding the events at the Pettit home, has resulted in such devastation and human loss. And so his argument to me was, I want to do something with my life that can help people, and with that in mind, I want you to write this book, and he even had a title for it, The Anatomy of a Monster. But his, and I thought, well, that's a great title, because certainly he is a monster, but his understanding was the monster was in fact not him, but substance abuse. And but for the substance abuse that had consistently sabotaged his life ever since he was 9 years old, the events that transpired in Cheshire would never have happened, which seemed like quite a stretch to me.
And he wasn't, I believe, he wasn't drunk or on drugs that night, was he?
No. Well, yes and no. He, prior to that night, and if any of your listeners have not seen the Cheshire Murders, the HBO documentary,
yeah, it's very good.
I can't recommend it highly enough. It's on, I believe Amazon Prime has it. But prior to the Cheshire Murders, he had been in a halfway house where he met Joshua Komisarjewski, and he relapsed and went on a 30-day crack and heroin binge. And so at the time of the Cheshire Murders, he told me that he was in a state of extreme withdrawal from those drugs. And I know based on the HBO documentary that he and Joshua found a lot of beer in the basement fridge of that home and drank off and on throughout the night. Well, I challenged him when we met with, how does drinking a beer, whether it's a six-pack or a half a case, how can you possibly correlate that to the evil that was committed on that night? And he was a bit taken aback by that question. It didn't follow into his logic. But he claimed that I think his whole being had been so saturated with drugs and alcohol that it made him into a monster he never thought he could have been. And
it's a mystery to a lot of people that this guy and Komisarjewski were two-bit thieves. They'd never really been into violence even. Mm-hmm. And what's the explanation for that out of the blue escalation?
Well, you know what? I think, and this is just my opinion based on talking to Mr. Hayes and then watching that HBO movie, is that the two men seem to have different agendas going into that crime. When they met at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting a night or so before July 23rd, Stephen Hayes was in a very bad place of desperately needing money. His mother was wanting him to move out of the apartment, and he wanted to get off drugs, and things were really falling apart in his personal life. So he was very consumed with, how do I get money? And Joshua, on the other hand, unlike Hayes, Joshua did not have a history of simply petty burglaries that were substance abuse related. Hayes's burglaries were kind of two-bit crimes where he would break into people's cars when they were parked at a campground to go hiking, and he would watch and wait for them to leave and take their money, and it was always for drugs and alcohol. Whereas Joshua had a history of 18 prior home invasions. And that was something that I don't even know the parole board knew about before they released him, was that the attorney for Joshua at that time had told the judge, keep an eye on this kid, he's trouble. And what Joshua would do, Joshua would go into people's homes at night and take the money and jewels, but he would often stay for hours at a time in the home. And it was gratifying to him to go into homes of people with more power, not just money-wise, but he would go into a state trooper's home. And it gave him a sense of command, that he could be in this man's home, watching the family sleep for hours without them knowing.
So he would go into homes with people there.
Yes, and that was part of the thrill.
The whole Pettit thing, too, yeah.
And a part of it as well was, Joshua came from a very extremely damaged childhood background where he was sexually molested at the age of 3 repeatedly by foster children that his parents had let into the home, older teenage foster children. And he had this, again, here we go with the fantasy. He had this kind of sick fantasy in his head of wanting to find a home, a family to be part of, and coveting not just those family relationships, but the possessions in the midst that these people had. So therefore, when Joshua and Stephen went into the Pettit home on that night, Joshua had already staked out Mrs. Pettit and her 2 daughters. He had already seen them in a Stop and Shop. shopping. He'd already, in some sick way, almost gotten an attraction to the children.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't just the fact that she had a Mercedes-Benz in the parking lot, and he knew that there could be money in this home, but it was something far sicker that I personally don't think Stephen Hayes partook in or was aware of.
So do you think that Komisarjevsky was then more of the orchestrator of this thing?
I do.
Oh,
I absolutely do.
I always thought it was Hayes. That's interesting.
Yeah, a lot of people do think that, but Hayes has said in the past to his parole board, I need people to tell me what to do. And I wrote in one of my blog posts, I think Hayes would make a perfect Nazi in a concentration camp. Mm-hmm. He does what he's told to do, mm-hmm. And he's very cowardly and without conscience, to the extent that when he was pouring that gasoline over that home, what on earth was this monster thinking? But
did they both rape the women, or was it just Joshua then?
Joshua, he did molest the youngest 11-year-old child, and that was allegedly why he suggested to Stephen that they burn the home down, because they had to burn the DNA evidence of what he did. Stephen strangled and raped Mrs. Pettit, and I asked him about that in our meeting, because I having watched that movie, I said she seemed like such a beautiful woman inside and out.
Yes,
she was a devout Christian. I know she'd been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis.
Right.
He said, yes, she was a lovely woman, very nice woman. Which again, this response he gives tells me that I'm dealing with a sociopath.
Yeah.
And he said that everything was really just going fine. She was nice to him. He was nice to her when they went to the bank and when they drove home from the bank after she withdrew the $15,000 that he and Joshua commanded her to do. And if someone were to see him walking into the house with her after that venture, they would think it was boyfriend and girlfriend.
And then again, something then escalated.
It did, and that's actually what transpired in the next 20 to 30 minutes is a really hot, controversial subject surrounding these murders, and it's to the extent that it's even one of the premises for Joshua Komisarjevsky. In February of 2017, his lawyers filed a request for a new trial, and with the Connecticut Supreme Court, and it surrounds the events that happened in that 20 to 30 minutes from when Stephen Hayes went into that house with Jennifer Pettit, and the 30 minutes that followed when, during that entire time period, the Cheshire police had the house surrounded, and the Cheshire police were aware of the 911 call from the bank teller mm-hmm. At 9:21 a.m. in the morning. There's argument, why didn't they stop the car and arrest Stephen Hayes and then run into the house? Hindsight is 20/20, but all of the most unspeakable events of that crime occurred in that 30-minute period, and Stephen Hayes tells me that when he saw the police surrounding the house, and Joshua told him that they were surrounded, and that Dr. Pettit had just escaped the basement, that he claims he blacked out. And so, perhaps conveniently, he does not remember the strangulation or the rape.
So they panicked, basically.
They panicked, and there is mention in other court filings, however, that there may have also been an element of rage that he felt against his victim in feeling like he had been betrayed.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell from our flagship station, WGCH Greenwich. Coming next, we'll get into the Route 8 murders. So stay with us. And we're back with Ann Howard, who's giving a fascinating description of Connecticut serial killers. And we're going to lead into the Route 8 and the New Britain strip mall murders, which she's kind of a specialist in, writing a book on one of them, in fact. And a good lead into that is Stephen Hayes. It fits right with your manipulative theory. Talk about his false confession, how it leads into this.
Right. In 2011, Stephen Hayes, while on death row, told the Department of Corrections in Connecticut, the officials, that he was willing to confess to 17 unsolved murders in Connecticut. And many of those murders involved 6 or 7 of the victims of the unsolved murders that took place along Route 8 between the dates of 1988 and 2004. And Stephen, as a manipulator, said that he would confess to these murders in exchange for pizza, soda, and a plate of oysters with hot sauce. And what his intent was that because he's deathly allergic to oysters, he wanted to commit suicide, which is, something that I find, whether it's with Stephen Hayes or the New Britain serial killer suspect I'm writing about now. Usually these men, when they're locked up and they have either life sentences or death row sentences, and they have all of these memories in their head, they are more than eager to die. And I think Stephen wanted to die on his terms and not have to wait through the long, stressful process of having the state confirm lethal injection. They caught on to it, and they did not deliver him those oysters. And, of course, those confessions that he was willing to make were all fraudulent.
Okay, so now why don't we get into the real killers that are involved? Go ahead. Okay,
well, the Route 8 murders, most of them involved women who had, unfortunately, had substance abuse addictions and therefore had, given into, making money on the streets and prostitution. And these women all came from, or at the time of the murders, were living in Waterbury, Connecticut. And
give us the time frame so people can.
That would be from October 1988 until I believe 2004.
Okay.
And so several of these women, their bodies were located between exits 39 and 42 of Route 8 in that Harwinton, Litchfield, Thomaston area. That's a heavily wooded and quite isolated area. In fact, that's part of that area is where Campville is, where 3 bodies were found. That was a part of the forest that was evacuated after the Great Flood in, I believe, 1955, with the Mad River overflowing. And so the Army Corps actually evacuated that town of Campville. So it's a desolate ghost town, and therefore a place where a serial murderer would think, great, no lighting, no busy roadways, no surveillance cameras, no witnesses. And so the perpetrator of those murders, whether it's one or many people, has never been found. There have been talks that maybe the New Bedford, Massachusetts serial killer, who also has never been found and had a similar target group, and also left his victims by the highway in New Bedford, Massachusetts, could have been the same man.
Do we have a name?
No, we have no names. I did interview a retired detective, Dave Carey, with the Litchfield police, state police, and he did mention one suspect to me, but I really am not comfortable mentioning that.
Okay.
But I will say that I did mention in one of my blog posts that William Devin Howe, who has been charged with the 6 remaining murders of the 7 individuals found behind the strip mall in New Britain, Connecticut. He was free and out of prison in 2004 at the time of one of the victims' deaths. And a couple of his victims that he's alleged to have killed were Waterbury prostitutes with substance abuse addictions. and he left those 2 women's bodies behind the strip mall in New Britain. So it's not much of a stretch to think that he could have killed another woman in that town and then relocated and disposed of the body along Route 8. Additionally, he used to live in Torrington, where I'm speaking right now, but he would be familiar with those woods. Now, of course, I'm not a private investigator, and I trust that the authorities have probably already looked into that possibility, and he has not been charged with any of that. So that's just pure speculation on my part.
What is this? Some sort of warped morality that's underlying these killings of prostitutes?
I think what it could be a punishment issue of morality and judgment, but I think more so it has to do with the prostitute as easy prey. And, I'd written about that in one of my blog posts, that Jack the Ripper, he located prostitutes in London, and why? Because they were easy targets. They're out at night. They're in alleyways and darkness. They make themselves vulnerable to strangers and put themselves in situations that, law-abiding citizens who are, sleeping at night with their doors locked don't fall into. So there's that if you imagine the killer as a predator in the jungle, well, this is easy prey. The other issue may be that these killers sometimes compartmentalize people in their lives, ones who have worth and value and they don't harm, and then ones who are not people at all but are objects. And so in that case, perhaps they do look at the more marginal group of people with substance abuse addictions and prostitution and classify them in that way, not unlike, how Hitler's ideology would classify different groups as having worth, and other groups are not even human beings. And that's all part of the bigger picture of evil.
I thought it was interesting. I think it was with him. One of the victims, he was linked to it by a single drop of blood in his van. Is that true?
Yes, and I have to give the disclaimer because there is talk of a plea deal right now that the prosecution has offered, and so it will be up to his attorneys on July 12th. They go before the court to determine whether or not they're going to accept the prosecution's plea deal. So at the time of this discussion, he is simply a suspect who has been charged with the crimes. He is currently in prison for the murder of Nilsa Arizmendi, right, whose body was subsequently found in April 2015 behind that strip mall.
Same place.
Same place. And there were 6 other victims in the similar proximity.
And her blood was found in his vein.
I believe, yes. And the defense and the prosecution never got to that issue at trial. It was in the court filings, and it was something that was going to be discussed at trial. Mm-hmm. They had a DNA expert who was going to testify that Carmen Arizmendi, the mother of Nilsa Arizmendi's DNA, which was a very highly likely match for that drop of blood. That never came to fruition because Howell ended up pleading under the Alford Doctrine in Connecticut, which is akin to like a no contest plea, where halfway through the trial, the defendant said, I agree that the prosecution has enough evidence to convince the jury of guilt without reasonable doubt, but I'm not pleading guilt. I'm just conceding that they can.
Do you know what the plea deal is? In other words, he would have gotten life. Let's say if he was convicted, he's going to get what now?
Well, in the trial for Nilsa Arizmendi took place in 2007, and Ken Simon, I got to talk to him. He was his public defender at the time. And rather than get 65 years, risk the jury finding guilt and getting him in prison for 65 years, under the Alford Doctrine plea deal, Howell only got 15 years.
Uh-huh.
So I felt it was a pretty good deal,
yeah.
Especially in light of the fact that there was a lot of evidence at that trial that had yet to even come into play. The current plea deal that the prosecution has offered regarding the 6 remaining charges, we don't know the details. His attorneys, of course, are being closed-mouthed about it, as is the prosecution. But I suspect that it will not involve an Alford doctrine type of plea, that it may be a more traditional plea bargain where the prosecution simply states all the facts that are alleged against Howell, and in a court of law he says guilty. I could be wrong. It could be a no contest Alford doctrine type plea.
So if he says guilty, then he's obviously saying he's willing to take a lot of years, but lesser than if he'd finished the trial.
You know, there is, in my opinion, and I think most attorneys, including his own, would agree with this, there's going to be no difference in the amount of years he gets, whether he takes the plea or goes to trial. I mean, to the extent that, is it going to be 5 lifetimes or 30 lifetimes?
So why wouldn't he gamble then and roll the dice and have the trial?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I've talked to Bill about that because I do visit him on a monthly basis, and we write, and he knows I'm writing this book about him. And, you know, I think there are a few things. He feels he's locked up for life regardless. He has consistently professed his innocence to me, but he has taken the view that the public and, you know, everyone has already determined his guilt, so he's sort of accepted that he's in for life. And so at this point, just to forego the stress of a long trial is a benefit to some extent. I mean, goodness knows the CNN and everyone's going to be all over it when it occurs. If it occurs, the trial would probably go for months, and also to save the victims' families and loved ones the repeated trauma of having to relive the experience all over again in a highly publicized trial.
So you meet with this guy. Is he sane? What's his deal?
Do you know, that's a great question because it begs the question, what is sanity?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, a lot of people say, I would have never guessed this or that. In fact, I was just writing in my book recently, I pulled an article from, I believe it was the New Britain Herald, where an older woman, nice older woman and her husband hired William Devon Howell to do some yard work for them at their house, and went for a drive with him to Home Depot to pick up some bushes in the van that he is alleged to have murdered 7 people in. And she described him as a very friendly, warm, nice Southern gentleman. He's from Hampton, Virginia, and in a lot of respects, I would agree with that. When we meet and talk, he is very, ironically, very warm. He's very friendly. Mm-hmm. He's been very open to me about different hurts he's had in his childhood and in his life, and but I also see signs of a career criminal. Granted, prior to Nilsa Arizmendi's murder conviction, all of his offenses were mostly traffic violation related and DUIs and petty theft. But there are traces I see in him of a great deal of anger.
Does he have? Did you find he has a big youthful abuse somewhere like these other guys, Hayes and Komisarjevsky, seem to have?
A youth of abuse. Well, I'm hesitant to give away my book to you.
Okay.
Before it gets published.
Give us a tease.
All right, I will give you a tease. He actually came from what I perceive to be a relatively stable blue-collar background. However, there are indications to me that there may have been some physical abuse. But you know what? I mean, if that's true of every serial killer, then every person that ever had a troubled childhood or abuse would be a serial killer. So there are definitely so many question marks if, in fact, he did commit these crimes. And again, I just say that as a disclaimer. The book that I'm writing is mainly dealing with the huge chasm between what I have read in police affidavits and court filings about the heinous nature of what he is charged with doing, and the man that I have come to know. And there is a very large gap. And, unlike Stephen Hayes, I don't think this man is a crafty manipulator. On the other hand, if he did do what he is alleged to have done, then he sure is keeping a lot of secrets from me.
Didn't you? I read in your blog that he was alleged to have slept with one of the bodies.
He did. He told another inmate that he killed this woman, but I think because it was so cold out in the middle of the winter, he wrapped up her body in a blanket in his van and slept with her for 2 weeks. That same woman, yes, that same woman, the inmate. Now, this is all according to the inmate. It hasn't been proven in a court of law, but the inmate contends that Bill said he sliced off this woman's fingertips. The only reason I could think of for that is to hide fingerprints in the future, and that he dismantled her jaw and buried it in Virginia. Well, what that resulted in was after his arrest, the authorities in Connecticut went down to Virginia and dug up the back lawn of one of Bill's close friends, and nothing was found. But yeah, again, that would go to the idea of fantasy.
All right, we've got a minute to go in this segment. You described that he's not had a visitor in 3 years. He's depressed. He's gained weight. Talk about him now and what you see.
What I see now is a profoundly depressed man. Since we've been corresponding, which dates back to July of 2015, he has expressed to me on numerous occasions a lot of suicidal ideations, and he has actually been on suicide watch a couple of times. Last summer, he tried to hang himself and failed in that endeavor. So he is absolutely without hope. He more or less watches TV and listens to the radio in total isolation, and has no hope of ever seeing the light of day.
Our final Forensic Talk segment, more on Connecticut murders, coming right up. And we're back, final segment with Ann Howard, expert on Connecticut serial killers. And unfortunately, we've got to go back and revisit this New Britain strip mall. Ann, and Robert Hodge, tell us about his horrific story.
Well, Robert Hodge is a 73-year-old man who is currently, as we speak, on trial in Springfield, Massachusetts at the Hampden County Superior Court for the murder of his wife, Marcia. At the time, she was 53 years old. He allegedly shot her and left her in the forest, the Tolland State Forest in Massachusetts. But a week prior to that, in late September of 1995, Hodge is also alleged to have shot his 16-year-old daughter, the daughter of Marcia that he had with Marcia, and wrapped her body in 2 sleeping bags and garbage bags, and left her behind the very same strip mall in New Britain off Hartford Road that William Devin Howell is alleged to have left his 7 bodies at almost a decade later.
Are any of these stores successful in that mall? I mean, I don't think anybody want to set foot on that.
Well, I know there was a Daddy's Junkie music store that was popular there, and it's no longer there anymore.
All right,
there is a restaurant there, and that always interests me. I went out to the site to look at it, and it was very interesting because it was a place you just never guess when you drive along this road. There's a big shopping mall right across the street. It is a very busy roadway. It's a commercial district, but there are 15 acres of unadulterated state forest behind that mall.
Well, this guy Hodge, he seemed pretty smart, too. He didn't report they were missing. He said they'd moved out of the country. He marries... Yes. And his ex-wife is supporting him in this, or?
To my knowledge, I don't think she's supporting him anymore. In fact, I think she may have been cooperative with authorities in getting him to where he is at now. But yeah, that's how he got away with it for so long. If in fact he did do it.
Do we know why he killed his wife and his daughter?
We don't. What he is alleging in his defense is that someone else must have done it, and he doesn't remember a thing. And he claims this defense of dementia, that whatever he witnessed was so traumatic that he doesn't recall.
Can you fake dementia, or do they have a way of saying medically he's not suffering from dementia?
I know that the defense has hired experts to examine him, and I'm sure anyone can fool an expert in that regard. But again, what this trial is going to come down to is just the hard, cold evidence. I think they've got some DNA evidence.
Have you met this guy?
I saw him. I went to the jury selection about a week or so ago. They took over 3 days to pick the jury, and I was just within feet of him. Again, not unlike Stephen Hayes. He looks like a very mild-mannered kind of old, aging gentleman that if you passed him in the grocery store, you'd think nothing of it.
All right, let's look back a little bit on the whole process. Do you get grief or questioned as to why you want to hang out with these guys? And does it make you unpopular? Do you have any issues along those lines?
Yes, and I'm sure to some extent criminal defense attorneys sometimes struggle with this, with people saying, how can you represent them? And even more so from a writing perspective, how can you write about this? And it's already been damaged people and families, and then how can you even be around such people? And that has been a little bit surprising to me in terms of the amount of anger that can get directed my way. It's something that anyone who wants to write true crime should be cautioned about. Before you get into it, know that you're going to get a lot of negative feedback from the public. But the reality is that this is a very popular genre. I know it's one that I love to read about, and I don't love to read about it for any reason of sensationalism or, it's for me, it's the question of evil versus good, and how someone who comes into the world as an innocent little baby can turn into this kind of monster, and how does that happen? And I want to explore that.
Let me ask you in that context, because from listening to you, evil versus good, but it doesn't look that black and white when you're face to face with these guys, right? You do see some redeeming qualities, or they don't seem to you to be completely evil. Am I reading you right?
I would agree with that, and I think that's why often victims can fall prey to this. Is that it's evil doesn't present itself as a devil with horns. It can, especially when it comes to a serial killer. Almost the more psychopathic or sociopathic they are, the more you may see a very well-practiced facade. But as in the case with the New Britain serial killer suspect, who I've by far come to know the best of all of these people, I do believe on one level that there is a goodness to him, which brings about the question of how can an evil person contain good. In his case, I have a family member now with a very serious cancer, and I've been upset about it, and I've been sharing it with him, and he, lost his mother, and his mother had cancer. And we speak a lot about the grieving process and the struggle of watching someone you love suffer. And I do feel on some level that he is being genuine. Throughout our visits, he cries. He frequently cries. And I can't explain it. I don't pretend to understand it.
Do you think these gentlemen want to be locked up because of a lack of impulse control?
I think they do, and that's why I think they want to die. I think they just want to be put out of their misery.
Yeah.
And, one inmate told the law enforcement that Howell had said to him if he could be released, he'd just keep on killing more. So maybe so, yeah.
Wow. If the plea deal goes through in July, when will your book be out on William Devin Howell?
Well, I am meeting with publishers in New York City in July.
Okay.
So I've got about 200 out of 300 pages written so far. I really could not finish it or even try to get it published until there is a legal resolution in the case. And I certainly didn't want to do anything to interfere with the trial proceedings because I do believe in the constitutional principles of, innocent until proven guilty. So I didn't want to tamper with the process. But now that this is coming to fruition, I would hope that by fall of 2017 we can get something out there.
Great, and we will have you back on when we get our hands on that book. Tell folks what your blog site is.
Oh, the blog site, if you were to just do a Google search for serial murders in Connecticut, you're going to find my blog site. I originally put it under a link that has Route 8 murders in Connecticut because it was intended just for that. But then as it evolved, I started writing about all sorts of other murders in Connecticut. So if you were to Google my name, Ann K. Howard, Ann with an E, like Anne of Green Gables, and then Serial Murders in Connecticut, you're going to find a lot of links to that blog.
A lot of fascinating stuff. It's been a fast hour. Thanks to Ann Howard. Thanks. See everybody next Monday on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Our honor, Ann. Thank you. Very good show.
Okay.